There are many in this industry who have had illustrious careers, but few have had a career as long as our guest today that has covered as many different areas, from mainframe computing to retail to being, well, part of one of the best design teams today on the market in the fighting game arena. And that is, and I probably should have asked how to pronounce your name before I did this, Graeme Bayless. Did I get it right?
Yes, that's correct. It's
perfect.
It's pronounced just like Graham Cracker. It's just spelled funny.
Okay.
It's the Scottish spelling. And as I'm often remind people, while I don't speak with the accent, certainly I come from that part of the world, or my family does. And yes, I got married in a dress. Well, a kilt, but.
Well, there you go. I was at a wedding once where I had to wear a kilt, and I definitely should have ordered it 2 sizes larger because I had to hold it together with some safety pins. But yeah, it was cool.
Yeah, the best part of that story is my wife likes to say that my dress cost more than hers.
That is definitely true. Oh my goodness, those things are expensive.
They are.
Okay, so let's do what we always do here. Let's go back to the beginning. Tell us a little bit about your educational background.
Sure. So a little bit strange. And when I say that, it's because I actually was undegreed until fairly late in my career. I went directly into the military out of high school. I did so for a variety of reasons. I had graduated from multiple high schools before I did so, but that's a story that I'm not sure how that interesting that would be to your audience. But I have a high school diploma from Robert Louis Stevenson in Pebble Beach, California, and from New Mexico Military Institute in New Mexico. And upon graduating from New Mexico Military Institute, I went directly into the military. At that time, I was already a gamer. I had become a passionate strategy gamer from about the age of 10. My parents bought me a board game called France 1940 by Avalon Hill, a new game that came out that year. And I was fascinated. I was completely hooked. And so, being 10, within a matter of a few years, I was convinced that my career path was to lead me towards, becoming General Patton or something. And so
now, just so we place ourselves, which year is this that we're talking about?
So I was born in 1963. So this would be, the Christmas of 73, 74. I think it was 74. And so, I'm just, I'm fascinated with games of all kinds at this point. I'm playing chess and other games that are, commonplace, but this idea of a strategy board game with that level of depth was novel to me, and I was just immediately hooked. By the time I was 14, I was doing game design. I had submitted works for paper RPGs that were beginning to be a thing. I was regularly playing an old board game by SPI called Firefight on the weekends at the Defense Language Institute in Monterey, California, where they were very kind enough to put up with a 14-year-old who wanted to play with these veterans who were, there to learn languages, but on the weekends would play board games together. And they let me join their ranks and were very kind to me and let me participate, but that just stoked the passions even more. So, over the next few years, as I went through and eventually graduated high school, that passion just kept growing. So as I said, once it came time to get out of the house and get on my own, I chose the military route because that seemed a natural fit. And so I went into the Air Force. I skipped tech school. There's a long story around that would bore your viewers to tears. But the long story short is I skipped tech school, went through basic training, then went directly to my duty assignment as a computer programmer. The reason I became a computer programmer, that doesn't seem like a good fit for somebody who wants to be general patent. That's largely because my mother was one of those, well, that's great and all, but how about you actually get a skill that's useful, which seems very logical in hindsight. And so I took that path, and it was sort of hybridizing it. That my military career was fairly short. It was very clear early on that I was not, shall we say, a perfect fit, at least not for that branch of the military. In hindsight, had I gone a different direction, gone Army and gone the whole thing, it might have gone a different way, but it just wasn't a great fit for me in the Air Force. And so, after 2 years, I parted with the military. They parted with me. Both of us together mutually agreed to part is the best way to put it. I mean, it's under honorable conditions and all that. It's perfectly reasonable. It was a mutual realization that I was not the right fit. I think the officer in charge, of my case when we were discussing it, basically said, look, I have zero doubt of what your career path is going to look like. This is just not the right place for you. And so, I left the military. I'm at this point 19. I joined at 17. Truth be told, I was too young to be out on my own in the military as well. So I left, joined the retail world at age 19, again, taking my sort of computer passion with me. And that led me out to the Silicon Valley, back to California, where I was from, to initially basically sell CP/M computer systems to small businesses. I always have had, shall we say, the gift of gab. So I fairly easily slid into that role. I had no sales background. I had no, I mean, obviously I'm 19. I have no background of any kind. But they gave me an opportunity to do that job, and literally from the first day I was in the job, I was on the at a trade show on the floor selling computer systems that I knew nothing about, but figuring out a way to sell people on them successfully. And that sort of took me down that path. Hey, I can read a brochure, right? So it takes 5 minutes to read the brochure, and then I can regurgitate that information just fine. But it was interesting. So I started at a little company in Milpitas doing this, and fairly quickly they adapted from selling these sort of pre-built custom-built CP/M machines into selling some of the early CP/M transportables. That shop specifically focused on selling the Kaypros system, and which was a competitor to the Osborne. And that was a very interesting time in the industry. I mean, it was one of the, it was a rapidly changing space. So much was going on so fast. And the nature of how computing was being used by consumers was changing so fast. The idea that computers would be used for personal use was something that was just exploding onto the marketplace, right? So early on, we had these CP/M machines. Within a matter of a few years, because I left the military in 1982, and by 1984, well, now we have the Macintosh, and now we have we have our PCs, and so it was I joined right at the end of the CP/M era and the advent of the PC era, and got to experience that transition. I spent a year selling CP/M machines, then a year selling PC clones, spent some time selling the first Macintosh, and then shifted over to selling integrated solutions for PCs with the first AutoCAD 1.0 as a vertical CAD CAM solution for businesses in Silicon Valley.
Now, if I can just interrupt for a second.
Of course.
So So you come out of the military, you go back to California, and is this? I'm trying to picture it. So you're working as a salesperson for the manufacturer or for
No, this is
a
for a
retailer?
retailer. Yeah, it was for a small business that it was actually, it wasn't even a chain. It was just a small business that specialized in dealing with small businesses.
Okay.
But I was only with that organization for a year. Moved to another one in Sunnyvale, and well, a year and a half, and then moved to one in Sunnyvale. Started selling Macintoshes and PC systems, and then moved over to another organization that was looking to do this vertical integration, and so I ended up doing the combination of the Texas Instruments PC with with AutoCAD 1.0 and started selling those as vertical integrated solutions. And did that for a while. I actually, intriguingly, I ended up speaking at the Texas Instruments National Sales Conference, which, by the way, was an experience, talking about doing this vertical integration of the TIPC with AutoCAD. Yeah, speaking to a group of 500 Texas Instruments salespeople in Dallas about this was an experience I will not forget. It was probably my first major public speaking experience, and it was a doozy.
Okay, so and I do want to get back to that speech, but just to set the stage. So the company you're working for has kit bashed this combination of parts at this point?
Yeah, I mean, realistically, there wasn't really much necessity to kit bash. The only thing they did is because for CAD/CAM you wanted to have the power of an 8087 math coprocessor, they would install an 8087 along with the 8086 inherent in the Texas Instruments PC, and that would allow the system to run the first AutoCAD well. And so without that, it was very, very slow. And so, that's pretty much the integration that we did. And then we would install AutoCAD and teach people how to utilize that for their businesses. And it was very successful. I mean, we sold a ton of these systems to various businesses of various sizes in the Silicon Valley, from large companies like I think we had a contract with Amdahl, who is no longer there, but was a large manufacturer of computers, and we sold a big contract pile to them, and to a number of other medium to large businesses, and some small businesses as well, who would have use of that type of software, architects, and so forth.
Interesting. And so when you're then invited to speak in front of these Texas Instruments people, was it? How does that come about that this small company with this very specific use of the hardware gets invited to speak there?
Just had to do with raw numbers. We sold a ton of units. And Texas Instruments went, hey, they're doing a thing, and that's making tons of money. We want to know more about this. And, so that's what led to it. I don't attribute that to any magic that I did or that the company did. I was successful because as a salesperson, my approach was one that I feel is the way that any person working in sales should operate, which is that I focused on building a relationship with the customer and finding out how to, optimally serve their needs, as opposed to just trying to pitch them whatever I had laying around to see if I could close a deal. And while that sometimes would land me in hot water with sales managers or directors, it was very good at building customer relationships, and it would land big accounts because I would build a trust relationship with the customer, and then suddenly I would end up with these, large contracts. And so ultimately it led to a whole lot of sales of this sort of a setup which got the attention of Texas Instruments. And so they wanted to bring me out and have me talk about what it was I was doing. Understand, at the time, I'm talking to an audience of people, most of whom have no idea what, even what these things are that are being sold, right? They, in many cases, they just view it as the next widget. And many of those people were used to selling Texas Instruments scientific equipment, because that's what TI was about early in their career. And they transitioned into computers because they saw it as an opportunity, and it definitely was a fit with their sort of technical background. And so, instead of now selling all the other devices that TI sold early in their career, they were now leaning into the PC space. Ultimately, it didn't end well for them because they couldn't keep up with sort of the changes in the industry. They fell behind, and then eventually, we know how that played out. But at the time, at least they were paying attention, and they were like, hey, this is a thing, we need to jump on this. And so when they built their first PC compatible, they put some real thought into it. They were building an 8086 based machine instead of an 8088 based machine. That was, that was something unusual at the time, right? PC was an 8088, and the difference between those is meaningful when you're, computing at that scale. So it was a good machine. The TI PC was quite a box for its time. And
very
so
cool.
This was a successful integration for as long as it lasted, until other people blew past us, because that was the speed at which that industry was moving.
So where do you go from there? So you're in hardware sales. You've got a programming background, and should probably go into that just a little bit more. So while you were in the military, you were working on mainframe computers, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I was a war plans programmer in the Air Force, which so there's a pretty funny story that I'll tell you at some point, but I don't want to digress from the timeline too much. But I was a war plans programmer in the Air Force, which means that I was responsible for writing software on our attack database for our strategic defense. In layman's terms, my job was to write code for making sure that our missiles and bombers didn't go to the same place at the same time, because that would be super bad for the bombers. And so I worked in, the languages of the time. I'm probably not supposed to name them, so I'll just leave it alone. But, these were on linked mainframe databases in the late 70s, early 80s. And so, fairly old technology. Understand the military is not exactly cutting edge usually when dealing with that. So these were, this was IBM 360, 370s, Amdahl V8s that were all linked together. And if you know what those numbers are, you'll know what I'm talking about. So, yeah, that's what I did. I wrote routines that worked within that branch. Our branch was called fratricide. So that's what I did for the time I was there.
Fratricide.
Yes.
Yeah.
Like I said,
okay, makes
making
sense.
sure
Yeah.
our bombers and missiles were at the same place at the same time. So yeah, that's what I did when I was in the military. The thing that's interesting, and I assume this is where the question is going, is like, why didn't you go into computer programming coming out of the military? The simple answer there is because, how do I put this? So programming is like many other parts of the the technology space, as much art as science, right? And learning to code is something that everybody can do. Being great at coding requires not only knowledge of how to code, but also a certain perspective of way of thinking. And the simplest way I can put it is that I learned fairly quickly that I could code, and I could code effectively. But it didn't come as naturally to me as it came to some others. And it's sort of, I'll put it this way. Think of it as learning another language. When you become fluent in a language, it's not just that you know the words, but you stop translating it in your head, right? You no longer go, this word means this, connect, speak word. You just speak the words. That's kind of the analogy I would use here. I could do the thing, but I never got past the I'm translating it in my head part. And so I wasn't as fast as other people would be, or I wasn't as intuitive as as a programmer as others might be. I could do the work and I could do it well, but it required me to sort of be methodical and calculate my way to the result in a way that others just sort of had happen naturally for them. And when I made that realization, I was like, okay, that in my head that translates to, you can be good at this, you'll probably never be great at this. And who wants to go into a path where they think they'll never be great, right? And so that was for me, that was the thing. It was like, okay, I'm never going to be a fantastic engineer. I should do something else. And that's what led to that decision.
Yeah, perfectly reasonable. I mean, actually smart, especially for a person that age, to realize, you know, this isn't what I want to do, or this isn't where I'm going to be great, so find another way.
I had very good parents from the standpoint of giving me that kind of guidance. I was very fortunate, and both my parents pushed me in ways that really helped me be grounded for things like that, right? You know, my father in particular would spend time explaining those types of decision-making processes and thinking things through in a way that would lead to outcomes that, you know, are what I wanted. And so this was another, you know, output from that kind of, you know, the way I was raised and the way I was raised to think.
Gotcha. And that is, yeah, valuable beyond value, actually.
I could not agree with you more. I mean, interestingly, I mean, you said start with the education. I actually should have included this, and I'll say it now. Part of the reason that I sort of stopped and didn't pursue a college degree until later in life is, frankly, I came out at age 17 with a better education from the high school I attended than most college programs will provide. Now, in fairness, I'm a reasonably bright human being. I'm perhaps not as bright as I once was, but I'm a reasonably bright guy. I was fortunate enough to get an opportunity. I mean, I attended college classes when I was a middle schooler because I was offered into gifted programs and so forth. But for me, you know, I was challenged by my high school, the private high school I went to in Pebble Beach, California, Robert Louis Stevenson, in a way that, you know, many public high schools don't, or at least at the time didn't. I can't speak about how it is at this point, but at that time, when I came out of RLS with my high school diploma, I was as well prepared as somebody coming out with a four-year degree. I had communication skills. I had, you know, understanding of all of the basics. I knew history. I knew math. I had music. I had gone through music, you know, training and could play the clarinet well. You know, I had a very well-rounded education, and so part of the reason I didn't pursue it aggressively past that was because, frankly, it didn't feel necessary, and it proved not to be. I eventually did choose to get it simply because it felt like a check mark that was worth getting. And so I don't want to be mean, but when I got my degree much later in life, it wasn't hard. It was literally like, here's the things, I'll check the boxes for you. Okay, can I have my piece of paper now? Thank you very much. I will put it on my wall. And so I was very blessed to have a strong education. It just happened to be at the high school level.
Gotcha. And that's perfectly reasonable. As someone who went straight the education route, yeah, a lot of what I've used in life I learned outside of school. I mean, it's just, yeah.
I think that's true for many people. But certainly I intend this not as a condemnation of advanced education at all. I think really for me, it came down to being blessed to have had truly outstanding teachers, and as well as a really great, personal support system, parents, that set me up for success in a way that many others do not get that opportunity, right? So I absolutely understand that my circumstance is unusual, and I was very, very fortunate.
And sometimes you just got to get lucky. Let's face it. That's luck has a huge part to play in success in life.
It most assuredly does. And as I learned, and as you'll hear if we get that far, either in this interview, as you'll learn, I've had my share of curveballs or the like thrown at me. So life presents you with opportunities. Life presents you with challenges. As I am fond of saying to people, you are defined by how you overcome the adversities. And so, everything's easy when it's handed to you, or everything's great when it's, going well. When it gets tough, that's when you find out who you are. So
very true. Okay. Then we are back. Let's move back to where we were in the plot, so to speak. You're in retail. Everything is moving very fast. It's the early 80s.
Yep.
Technologies are changing quickly. What do you do next? What's the next act?
Well, so I actually shifted from, shifted is wrong, because I was still in hardware sales still, as well as software sales, but I ended up at a company called Software Galleria. Software Galleria was a franchise of software stores in California, primarily in California. And I landed at the corporate store. So in other words, this was the store owned by the corporation. It was the franchise headquarters. And then all the other franchises were, branched off from that. They were all individual stores that had purchased franchise rights to be Software Gallerias elsewhere. But I was, acting as the sales manager for the corporate store. And that was a very interesting time. I was doing both hardware sales and software sales, and witnessing again the sort of evolution of the industry, and even the evolution of the store, because suddenly the advent of the idea of games integrated into the computing space became a thing, right? And so we're selling PCs, we're not selling early consoles. But those PCs can also play games. The sales manager for this entity was friends with a gentleman by the name of Tom Frisina, whose name I'm sure you know. Tom Frisina was one of the original executives of Accolade back in the day. And so Tom swung by the corporate store, and our sales manager, or our head of sales, introduced me to him and said, "Hey, he's really into games. You should talk to this guy." And I was like, "Oh, okay." And we hit it off. I talked about games. He thought that I seemed to have some knowledge that he appreciated. And so the next week he swung by and he brought by a series of their early games that were not yet released, and basically asked for my feedback. And I was like, "Hey, happy to do that." And so, we're talking some of their early games, the Dam Busters, Mean 18, what was it? Law of the West, I think it was the name, something like that.
Law of the West, yeah.
Yes, okay. But these were pre-release, right? And he basically was asking for, feedback and comments. And so I looked at them, I gave feedback and comments. but it piqued my interest. It sort of got me to go, hey, this is a thing. And so I that sort of got me interested in the idea of this as a path, right, for me. So I, at the time, again, was working in the industry for, sort of peripherally. Software Galleria, so what that time was like. It was very volatile in the industry. Software Galleria imploded not too long after that, as many businesses did at that time. And they were caught in that wave of annihilation that took place in that era. And so I actually ended up taking a job in just technology. I was basically a test technician at a defense contractor for a while, but the interest had been piqued. And so this is mid 80s, so now fast forward another year into 1987, and one day I saw an ad on a corkboard at a local game store, a tabletop game store, and that ad was for a weekend part-time playtester for a company called Strategic Simulations. Now, of course, by this time, I was now pretty passionate about everything I could get for a computer game, whether it be Apple II or what have you, whatever platform I could get my hands on. And so I was already an avid fan of their content. I'm like, oh, that would be awesome. I'd love to do part-time playtesting work for those guys. So I went and applied, and went out there and interviewed with them. And the interview was fairly hilarious. Because as part of the interview process, it's a small company. It was less than 40 people, and they didn't have a full-time QA department of any kind. They basically did casual testing, and the person who interviewed me was their head of customer service, that being a department of one. And so she interviewed me, and was impressed with my knowledge and my ability to speak coherently, and said, hey, you should, we want to have you also meet the person who ends up taking a lot of these, our customer service calls, because we might want to have you interview for a customer service job, and that's a full-time job. I'm like, oh, that sounds great. And so I came back to interview for that, and interviewed with the person who had been the one taking most of those calls, who was also one of their lead engineers. Yeah, well, small company, right?
Yeah.
And so I met with that that person, and a guy by the name of Russ Brown, and Russ interviewed me and was like, okay, let me get this straight. You own every single game we make. You have played every single game we've made to completion or nearly so. Yeah, you're certainly qualified for this job. That's not a problem. But you also have pretty deep knowledge of games in general and, passion for the industry. You should really come back and interview for the game developer position, which in today's terms would be called an assistant producer or associate producer. And I was like, sure, right? So, what started out as me applying for a weekend gig ended up being me applying for basically an AP position. And so, it's 3 interviews now, and now I'm meeting with Chuck Krogel and Joel Billings, the founders of Strategic Simulations, and they gave me the job. And so before I knew it, I was going from, sort of being on the outside of it to suddenly now I'm in it. And so I joined SSI in 1987. Go ahead.
Sorry. Just to go back before we get too deep into it, because I'm going to have a lot of questions there. I've interviewed Joel, so I know a lot about the inner workings there. But so going back, so you're also tabletop gamer at this point?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, as you'll recall from my previous mention, I was a tabletop gamer since I was about 10 years old, right?
Yeah.
I started playing tabletop games. I actually did a little bit of game design early in that time period. As a matter of fact, during this same time period, I was actually really beginning to get into the industry from the standpoint of being on the outside, participating in and submitting designs, participating where I could with people that I met along the way. So I definitely had the passion for the tabletop industry as well as the computer industry.
Okay. So and then that just want to connect that passion is still ongoing at this point.
Oh yeah.
And you're gaming at home on an Apple II at this point. You haven't moved over to a C64 or anything.
See, nerds.
Oh.
Anyway, yes, that passion still exists today.
Sorry, now
threw you for a loop.
Previous discussion about Mortal Kombat. I'm like, now let's turn Mortal Kombat into a turn-based strategy game.
But that would be an interesting conversation to have. I don't know if they'd go for it, but I'd be in.
Yeah. Nowadays, with my reflexes being what they are, I could do that. So
it's about my speed as well.
Yeah, exactly. So you are so you're doing most of this SSI gaming on an Apple II at this point?
Correct. I had, for my personal computer, I had an Apple II. I had both an Apple II and a Commodore 64.
Okay.
I mean, I had previously had, the early stuff, the cartridge-based systems like the Ataris, and Intellivision and so forth. But, I was not in the industry at that time. I was just a consumer. And those were, obviously very fascinating to me and something I enjoyed a great deal. But I would say the Apple II was, very compelling because of the types of games you could have on it. Obviously, the idea of having the ability to make saves and have a game that you could, have progression on, as opposed to something that's on a cartridge where you just sit down and play an instance and then it's done when it's done, was very compelling to me. I've always been very fascinated with the idea of the importance of what I called, at the time I called continuance in games, which is having progression in a game in a meaningful way. Obviously, it's something we know a lot about now from the standpoint of the maturity of the industry. And there are, many genres that is a core tenet of. But for me early on, my roots were such that was very important to me. In having a reason to sort of do whatever I was trying to do in the game, right? Because if it was just if I'm playing Space Invaders or something, what's my reason, right? What's the end game here? What am I trying to do, right? And having something that gave that carryover feel of progression, and feel like I'm growing and then facing new challenges that are new and interesting and sort of upping the ante was a very compelling path for me. It's what drew me into, tabletop RPGs and so forth. And finding ways to apply that to tabletop games is actually something I still do today. Ironically, as soon as we're done with this, I'm going to be going on and playing a tabletop game with a campaign system that I built for the express purpose of adding continuance to a game that does not have any.
Interesting. So modification of an existing game?
Yeah, it's basically an overlay system for a very, very complicated tabletop war game called Advanced Squad Leader.
I know the name. I cannot say that I've actually played it.
It's just as well the rule book is about that thing.
Okay, so it's the kind of game that computers were made for.
Very much so. Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
And one of the things that computers do well.
Exactly. Okay, so you've landed this job, and you were just about to say, sorry, when I interrupted,
No, it's fine.
Position was the official title.
The official title was game developer, but this is early industry, so the titles are whatever they are. And truth be told, that my job was even more amorphous than what would be today called a producer. So for years, I have described the position of production in the game industry very simply. I said, you know what an artist does, you know what a programmer does, you know what an animator does. Okay, so all those creative tasks, great. Everything else that isn't those, that's what producers do. And it's an oversimplification, but it's actually kind of accurate, right? So in the early days, my position as a game developer, I did design, I would write manuals, I would ensure that all the communication took place, and I would facilitate getting the box done or whatever was required to ensure that the product got out the door, right? I generally wasn't making artwork, and it's for the best. I didn't do any real code. I would do some scripting, but that's pretty lightweight. But I would do design. I would do a ton of research, and then like I said, everything else necessary to get the game out the door.
Okay, now, and that brings us to an interesting point, because you talk about design here. Now, in your position as game designer at that point, were you also making decisions about the very concepts of the games? Were you bringing concepts you developed to management for approval to go into production, or were you being given assignments like, okay, we need a game this year that recreates the Civil War or something like that?
So at this point in my career, I was doing not the design work I was doing was support design work, which is to say that there was somebody else who was, understand this is at this era, the game is generally built by one person. So, the Gary Grigsby's or the David Landry's or the what have you of the industry, they would generally do all the heavy lifting, right? They would write the code, they would do the game design, they would do the artwork, they would do all the pieces for the game. The design work I would do was generally in support, right? So, for example, I would, when I'm working with, David Landry on one of his historical simulations, I would help with the research. I would design scenarios and that sort of thing. Whereas he's doing the core design work of here's the mechanics of how the combat system will work. So it was much more design support. And truth be told, my strength, as I learned over time, was really what now is termed a systems designer. I'm much more of a systems design guy than I am a story design guy or the moment-to-moment gameplay design guy. I'm much more of the what is the meta systems and how can we connect the dots there. So doing things like scenario design, I've done a ton of that through the years, and things associated with that would be more the parts that I would do too. I've done a lot of level design as well. But we'll get into that as we move forward through the career. We'll talk about some of those pieces.
Okay, so this is the era of SSI when they're still quite literally living up to the name of strategic simulations.
Very much so.
The D&D license hasn't landed yet.
Well, actually it has, but it's not out yet. So when I joined them, it's actually kind of funny. When I joined the company, there were, I think I was the 41st person at the company at the time, and 39 of them were working on Pool of Radiance, truthfully. Well, probably more like 36, and then there was, one person who was responsible for customer service and a reception. You get the idea. So functionally, the whole company was working on Pool of Radiance, and myself and one other individual did everything else. so my Dick Vollers and I were the there's a story to this, so I'll laugh when I say it. We were the Siberia group. We were called that because of the nature of the building. So the building that they were in Mountain View at the time was this long, narrow building with a parking lot along one side, right off the freeway in Mountain View on Rengstorff. And that building, basically the way it was set up is the bulk of the offices were at one end, and then there was manufacturing and, shipping and so forth and storage. And then there were two little offices at the end, which was us, right? Oh, wow. So we were physically isolated from the rest of the group. Frequently you would have to go outside to get to our two offices. So we referred to ourselves as Siberia. In fact, the whole company referred to us as Siberia. So, we were out there on our own. And it made sense because everybody else is focused on Pool. And, often that was sort of confidential, blah, blah, blah. And so we were off just doing our thing. And understand that almost all of SSI's development was XDev, external development, right? So there was one person outside the company working on a game. We would work with them and facilitate everything that needed to be done, support them, like I said, doing support design. And so it was Dick and I working with the Gary Grigsbys, the David Landrys, the Westwood Studios in their early days to develop all of these titles. So the first year I got there, 1988, before Pool got launched, well, I was in there in 87, but the end of 87 and then through 1988, I think I shipped 31 SKUs.
Wow.
Right. Now, understand, I'm like, 24 years old at this point. So sleeping under my desk was not a big deal. And so, yeah, it was just the two of us. And we were knocking out as many games as possible to support the company while they all worked on Pool of Radiance. And it was a blast. We actually were able to hire a couple of people to test. So we had a little tiny QA group, and it was us and them. And we did all the games to keep the company afloat while we got Pool of Radiance out the door. And obviously that was a huge success for them. So for us, I say them because they're not around anymore. So,
well, yeah,
sadly.
True. So now obviously Pool of Radiance becomes the foundation for the Gold Box engine, which keeps getting reused. Yep. And before that, SSI's primary products are turn-based strategy games.
Correct, and RPGs.
And RPGs,
yeah. I mean, there was, Demon's Winter, Shard of Spring, Quest Run 2. There was a whole series of RPGs. Funny story about Quest Run 2. I just have to say. So Quest Run 2, Westwood game, right? So one of Westwood's very, very early games, and we worked with them on it. But I like to say this particular anecdote just because it is unique, and I don't think anybody else in the industry can say this. It is without a doubt the biggest faux pas ever in a game released, because this game would format your hard drive. Now, to be clear, we didn't know that was a thing, right? Understand, hard drives exist, but they're not really on gaming systems, and certainly we didn't know there was one for the Apple II, right? So this is a game release for Apple II, Commodore 64 at the time, right? Didn't think it was a problem. So for Quest Run 2, you'd start it up, and it would say, okay, insert character disk for formatting. So you take out your disk, you put in your character disk, you say enter, and it would format the disk. But it didn't know about hard drives, and it would simply go to the first logical drive it found. It was like, oh, that looks good.
Oh my God.
It only happened to one person. They were not happy as we formatted their accounting system. But anyway.
Oh, Jesus.
But not many people get to say that they shipped a game with a bug so bad that it would format your hard drive. I am that guy. Anyway,
was
sorry.
this before or after you hired the QA team?
This was before. Well, actually, I'm not entirely sure. It might have been after. But, I mean, regardless, we didn't have any idea. Now, after that, obviously, we did, and nothing like that ever happened again. But it does make for a great story.
That's awesome.
So anyway, yeah, we did work on RPGs as well, but you're mostly correct. Most of the games were basically hardcore military history war games, right? So, and we put out a bunch of really good games during that era. I mean, one of the games I want to say we put it out in 1988 was Battles of Napoleon, and received. It was pretty much the end of my career at that point, because that was a game where I actually did quite a bit of design work in collaboration with our programmer, designer, artist. But I did a bunch of design work, a bunch of research work on that. Normally, that would have been a game where Chuck Krogel would have worked very, very closely with Dave Landry on the development of this game, but he was super busy with Pool of Radiance, and so I just sort of stepped in and did a lot of heavy lifting. and you know, it went out there, was extremely well received. It received a review in Computer Gaming World entitled "Better Than Sex," which pretty much is the end of one's career, because where the hell do you go from there? But anyway, we did a lot of hardcore historical simulation games. That was really what our areas of focus were.
Yeah. Now, did SSI have any kind of system for providing tools to those individual developers in order to facilitate, since you were doing so many games of the same type, or was everything basically everybody was making their own engines?
Pretty much the latter. I mean, Gary Grigsby had his, lack of a better term, engine that he used for his games. That was adapted, right? So the Conf group became that series of game, the Steel Panthers and all that stuff on the later end were all based on that sort of core set of tools that he built for himself. Likewise, David Landry, there were a lot of similar games, the Sons of Liberties and Battles of Napoleon and so forth, that sort of followed that engine use of that he built for his own purposes. We didn't really provide tools to the developers. We provided support to them in whatever capacity we could, but by and large, it was all homegrown. This was really before the advent of modern engines, right? So, they weren't, I wouldn't say they were building engines for themselves. They were building a game, and then they were reusing components of that game for future games as a basis.
Gotcha.
I mean, functionally, it's kind of the same as engine work, but I don't think they set out saying, I think I'll build an engine to allow myself to build 6 games. They said, I'm going to build a game. Okay, now I'm going to reuse some pieces of that and make new pieces and make a new game.
Gotcha. Now, and you also said that Apple II and C64 were the lead platforms, at least for games like Question.
And then obviously we added Atari, specifically when you got into like the Atari ST. And, so you start adding more sophisticated systems there, and then PC. We did add PC in I want to say 88. So we started really, we started doing a lot of porting to that platform, because obviously it was a good platform for doing this. And so we started taking Apple II games or Commodore 64 games, and we would port them to PC. And in fact, we had, my brother, who has his own long storied career in the industry, I actually brought him. He had found me a job in the defense contract side. I found him a job at SSI, and he joined as a programmer, and he did the PC port of Pool of Radiance. So
okay, and this is going to be my next question. So you've got the original designs from these auteurs, if you will, and now the porting. Is that primarily being done in-house, or is that also being farmed out to different outside teams? And if so, what is that communication like? What is the documentation that you're getting on both the game mechanics look like, so that these ports are somewhat similar from platform to platform?
Great question. So to answer your first question, most of the time it was done with an external partner of one form or another. There were a number of parties that we would work with, some domestic, some foreign, who would handle the porting duties. But there were some in-house, right? I mean, Pool of Radiance we did ourselves because obviously Pool of Radiance, right? And truth be told, that engine that Pool was on, the Gold Box game engine, was the first legitimate engine build experience we had, and then they iterated on it and did the Dark Sun engine. But that was a legitimate for-purpose built engine, right, for the purposes of doing these series of games. But most of the games that Dick and I worked on, the external partner games, were largely being ported by external parties. Some were by the parties themselves, some were by other developers we would hire to port the games. To answer your question about how do we handle that, how does the documentation work, I'll be blunt and say it was pretty loosey-goosey. I mean, this is a fairly immature era of the industry, so I would love to tell you that we had this grand plan and we would provide them all this documentation. That is not true. It tended to be very much what we could pull together, and we would give them what information we could, and then there would be a lot of conversations to get clarification and so forth. And it wasn't always perfect, but it was expected that the small development team would be looking out for things that weren't right and ensuring that those things were addressed so that the games were as clean and precise a port as possible. To be fair, these were not super complicated games by today's standards. So you're talking about porting a game that was built by one person. It's not a horrifying task to have one other person try to go through the code, and most of these were not built in a format that was difficult to read or difficult to absorb. So it was not that tough a process. We really never had any difficulty getting these ports across, and they were all pretty good ports. Certainly by today's standards, where sometimes you'll have ports that don't measure up. The bar was relatively low in that the platforms themselves, the capabilities of them were relatively modest. So it was not super difficult to make a pretty competent port that would stand up in comparison to the original.
Gotcha. Now, you mentioned these more advanced platforms, Atari ST, PC. Mm-hmm. At what point does the target hardware start to shift away from the 8-bit home computers like the Apple II and the C64?
Yeah, that transition was interesting. And it was I would say it's kind of sneaky, right? This is the first time that the industry had really felt that kind of a transition. And so, I think in hindsight, we were all kind of learning as we went in regards to how the expectations of the consumer are going to evolve and how the needs of the hardware and software are going to have to keep up in order to meet those demands and those expectations. Ultimately, I think that that probably was one of the contributors to sort of the eventual arc of SSI itself, because not just because of the hardware. There's a much other factors, and we can get into that down the pipe. But the industry was changing. We were seeing the advent of consoles, right? And that was changing the game space significantly, where suddenly instead of just these personal computer systems, you are now having purpose-built machines for the express purpose of playing games, right? And much more sophisticated games than the early Ataris and the early the Intellivisions and so forth. You are now talking about games that were very much every bit as capable as the types of games that we were building for these personal computers. And that transition was most assuredly being felt by everybody working in the business. At the time, we didn't have a concept of a separation between console and, PC. And suddenly now this was a thing, right? You had Nintendo and you had, the Sega system, and, that was a sort of a new world as those machines were developing, and the types of games that were becoming available on them were much closer to what we were doing on the PC side. And so it created this really interesting challenge. And, to some extent, the separation was still there for a while. Those games were still, if they did a strategy game, it was much more strategy light, right? There's a big difference between Advance Wars and an SSI game. So that separation was fine for a while, but I would think it's safe to say that over time, that line got a little blurry, and that presented some interesting challenges. Speaking for myself, I certainly was getting tugged by interest in the evolving space. And so I found myself, being very interested in sort of touching that side of the space. And from a personal growth perspective, I had some ambition to stretch my design legs, because largely in this role I'd been in at SSI, my design chops were lightly used, right? I was much more a facilitator, much more of a coordinator than I was a designer, even though I would get design opportunities. And so, around right at the end of or right in the middle of 1990, I actually made the jump, and I left SSI to join a company that you already know very well because you've had conversations with Roger Hector, a company by the name of Sega Technical Institute, which was an offshoot, an experiment, if you will, a combination Japanese-American development company that was founded by Mark Cerny, a name I'm sure you know.
Yeah. And I've
And
requested interviews, haven't got one, but
I understand. Well, I'll talk only lightly about Mark. Mark is a very, very interesting cat. But Mark hired me to be the first American designer on a hybrid Japanese-American team.
Now, before we get there, my chronology obsession. So, which year do you leave SSI?
1990.
1990. Okay. At that point, were you still in Siberia this whole time, or had you also been sucked into the D&D machine?
I had been sucked into the D&D machine lightly, but only lightly. So we actually, we still had the sort of the Siberia team. We were still doing all that stuff, but the D&D machine was expanding, right? It was beginning to really move. And so I would say that, I'm trying to remember exactly when we moved buildings. I'm pretty sure we moved in the time when I was away. So I don't think I was there for the exit from the Ring Store facility. I'm old, so bear with me.
No problem.
But yeah, the company was beginning to grow, right? During, obviously Pool came out, and, was a success. It started to really gain some momentum. We actually, that led to an expanding relationship with TSR. I'll talk about Buck Rogers in a minute, but there's a story there. Yeah, so they were rapidly pursuing what could we do with this, and that was becoming sort of a focal point for the company. We absolutely were still very much interested in doing the legacy stuff that was the heart of SSI, right? We expanded that. I mentioned some of the later projects like the Steel Panthers and the and Panzer Strike and so forth that took place during that period in '89, when Pool was already out, and we were still putting out a lot of really interesting and compelling stuff. But the Siberia side was also expanding and trying to do more, right? We actually worked on a project. There'll be some commentary here, I'm sure. Worked on a project called Hillsfar, again with Westwood Studios, using the D&D license, right? And that was all during this period as well.
So just out of curiosity, those non-gold box D&D games, Hillsfar, Dragon Strike, and so forth, later on Stronghold, were those Siberia projects? Was that treated as a separate development side of things?
It was. Once Pool of Radiance launched, there was a little better synergy between the Siberia side and the main company because they had focus, that they could spare, right? So there was more dialogue, more interaction. Chuck was less heads down trying to, guide the development of Pool of Radiance. And so there was a lot more interaction between the groups. but there was, there was an opportunity for, they basically wanted to take advantage of the success in every way that they could, right? So this was just like, you do this over here, we're going to work on this over here. And so there was a lot of initiatives to try and pursue that. Hillsfar was one of them. And then of course I mentioned it before, there was the advent of the Buck Rogers Ask. So, which was also pushed to that side, right? That led to me ending up meeting Flint Dilley, who was the executor of the Buck Rogers estate, and conversations with him and his team as we looked into chasing that franchise and chasing that license.
Okay, so that the Buck Rogers license at SSI uses the Gold Box engine, or at least a modified version of it.
Correct.
So this would have been, was this your first encounter or use of the Gold Box engine?
Oh yeah, very much so. I mean, it's, but again, I was relatively engine agnostic. The stuff we worked on, it was all just a question of again, these weren't engines per se to us. They were just a game that was built on legacy technology. That just made it easier to get up the curve so that we could get to the point where the game was playable, and then we could start working on what we did with it from there. So
gotcha. Now, and I do have to go back to Hillsfar for a moment.
Yeah, sure.
And you were also involved with the 2 U.S. Gold games. What was it? Heroes of Flame? No, Dragons of Flame.
Dragons of Flame and Heroes of the Lands.
Yes.
Yeah. So yes, that's true. That was, man, was that 1989? Or yeah, that might have been 1989. I'd have to go look at my records to get the exact date, but I think that was 1989. But yes, that's correct. I actually ended up being embedded in England for a time to work on Dragons of Flame. And so it was myself and George McDonald embedded over there with the development team to get that game out the door. So yeah, I spent, I don't know, a couple of months in Manchester as they tried to wrap the game up and get that thing shipped.
So what was your function in the try, or what does it look like to have to come in and try to get this external team to get that product out?
I mean, again, early days, we're looking at small teams or teams of 1 or 2. And so functionally, it was the same kind of a job. It's a little bit of light design work, and then a lot of production coordination. So it's making sure that the teams had whatever they needed to be able to accomplish, making sure that the licensor was informed and that they were approved, and so that we were crossing our T's and dotting our I's, making sure that the test teams were testing and that that any issues found were being reported and redressed. Coordination, that's what producers do. And so that was the job that I was performing. That was the role I was performing on this. So a role I performed a lot of. Now, one of the things that I should mention that's interesting is that during this period of time with SSI, there was, the products were getting more complex. There was an increasing number of them. And one of the falling out is not the right word. One of the areas of tension I had with the company was, hey, we really need to formalize. I was pushing for a formal QA group, right? Effectively, a full-time group of people that we could, organize around, have a formalized QA process, because it was a little bit catch as catch can. We would have testers assigned to games, and that's fine, but it wasn't quite as organized as I would like it to be, and I kept sort of making a pitch for this as being something I wanted to do. This is relevant because I'll simply give you the fast forward machine and say, I spent some time at Sega, and then I returned to SSI. And when I returned to SSI, it was because they had attempted to build a organized QA effort and wanted me to come back and get it right. That they hadn't had the success they were hoping for, but they liked the idea and they agreed with me at this point that they wanted to do it. And so I was actually brought back to be the QA manager, and then ended up being a producer and QA manager.
Gotcha.
And working on, and helping get Buck 2 out the door and working on other games. But we'll come back to that in a minute. So I just mentioned it for relevance because it's important to this part of the story. So yeah, it's QA is something that's still a little bit, like I said, catch as catch can. People are assigned to games and to play them and test them to the best of our ability. But as the games get more and more complex and more sophisticated, that becomes a bigger challenge, and it becomes a little bit harder to sort of find all the key stuff. Understand that this is still an era where it's not like you can patch a game. When you ship it, you ship it. And so, it was very, very important to get it right the first time. There are examples of games during that era that shipped that were not great and became something of legend of being, remarkably buggy battlecruiser. Anyway,
so okay. Now, one of the weird things about Heroes of the Lance and Dragons of Flame, because they're, and correct me if I'm wrong, they're fully developed in England,
yes.
From concept up.
And they're a completely different type of game for us, right? I mean, they're side scrollers, right? So this is not our normal area of, the type of game we usually build, right? Yeah. So it's a unique experience.
And those games were also being released for several more platforms than you would have had in the States.
Absolutely. They were on everything we could put them on.
Spectrum, Amstrad, NES ports, and all this stuff. So what was it like? How was that level of complexity in the development? What was it like to adjust to that? Was it a big leap or not?
Oh, yeah. It was incredibly complicated. I mean, that was an era where, it's not fair to say this because every era is like this to some extent, but it definitely felt like so much was changing so fast and so many things were coming at us all the time. It was hard to keep up. And so it really required a lot of diligence from the people on the team. That's why there were 2 of us over there, right? Trying to make sure that all of those pieces were aligned and everything was nothing was getting missed, and that the games were solid and ready to go out the door and hopefully be well received. That series did okay. I wouldn't say it was a hit. But there was a lot of learning for us in that, right? We were doing a type of game we'd never done before. We were doing it on all these platforms. And so, there were a lot of challenges in doing it. I'm proud of what we accomplished. Ultimately, the game wasn't a flop, but it was certainly not a runaway hit.
Gotcha. Now, you mentioned Hillsfar earlier. And this is a game that I personally have very, very fond memories of the non-gold box D&D product. Mm-hmm. For some reason, the gold box games at that point in my life did not click with me. I didn't become a pen and paper player until much later in college.
I understand.
But those other ones sort of grabbed me, at least on the aesthetic level.
Right.
Hillsfar and Dragonstrike were two that I have extremely fond memories of. Don't know how well they would hold up today, but you mentioned that there's story. No, probably not. I still think the Dragonstrike game, there's a better execution of that one today would be.
I agree, actually. I actually think that, truth be told, I think that there's a lot of legacy games like that if modernized could have some real throw weight today. There's some examples of it happening right now. Wizardry, for goodness sake, has been remastered and released, and it's reasonably competent. It's pretty interesting. So I think there's merit to some of those old games. They have some real magical moments in them.
Definitely. So going back to Hillsfar, you said you were hinting at there's a story there.
Sure. So the story on Hills Far was, I'll give you the quick and simple version, and then you can decide if you want to dig deeper. The quick and simple version is, I was still relatively young. I was smart enough to be dangerous, and so I still hadn't figured out that I didn't have all the answers. and I mean, how do I put this? I mean, everybody goes through evolution in their life where they have epiphanies and realize things about themselves. I was used to being if not the smartest guy in the room, certainly one of the smartest guys in the room. And so I developed a certain degree of self-confidence, which, while beneficial at times, could sometimes get in the way. This was one of those examples. I didn't end up having a great relationship with the Westwood team because I kept pushing back on aspects of their development where I was like, I don't like this aspect of the lockpicking puzzle and, so forth, aspects of the game that they liked better than I did. And so I was pushing back on them as their producer and going, no, I'm concerned about this. I'm concerned about this. So much so that they basically went to Chuck and said, this guy's driving us crazy. and so I actually ended up getting swapped off the project about when it hit beta. And so Brett Berry took it the rest of the way and finished the game. So I actually didn't see that one through to completion. The reason I mentioned it is because it was sort of a good beginning lesson for me to sort of get some wake up about, hey, you know, there are better ways to handle certain things, which I think everybody gets at various times in their lives. So it's easy to look back on now and sort of go, yeah, I was probably being a little bit of a jerk there. And so, yeah, ultimately, Hills Far ended up being Brett's project, not mine, even though I did work on it for a significant portion of the development arc.
Gotcha. Well, and yeah, I can definitely see how young people, I mean, the Westwood guys are not that old at this point probably either.
Nope. They were probably about the same age I am, actually. I think, I want to say Lou Castle's maybe a little older than me, but not by much. And Brett Sperry.
Yeah. So when you're, okay, and this is probably a great example of how those interactions are happening. So are you driving over to the Westwood offices to check in on the work? Are they sending you copies of builds of the project? What does that interaction look like?
Mostly it was them sending builds. I think I only visited the Westwood offices once in the development of the project. By and large, it was them sending builds and then me reviewing builds and giving commentary. And that actually was pretty typical. I would say most of the time that was the way it was done at that time. I mean, the only time I ever met, Gary Grigsby or Dave Landry when I was working on those games was, after we had shipped. Perhaps they would swing by and we'd hang out and, hey, how's it going? Nice to meet you, sort of thing. And so most of the time we were on the phone and I was looking at builds that they had submitted and sent for, review with notes of, hey, this is broken, but, here's some things I want to look at, that sort of thing. And then me giving feedback on what they had sent over.
And I am curious here because Hills Far always felt to me like a very DOS PC game. Yeah. Was that the lead platform for that game, or?
Yes, it was. I mean, realistically, it was developed. I want to say they were all developed in conjunction, but I think it was very much a PC forward design. Certainly the way that, I mean, you hit it, the way the interface worked, right, was very PC centric. And to some extent that was one of my complaints, right? So yeah, you've correctly observed a piece of it.
I mean, I'm curious, what was one of your complaints about the interface?
in a nutshell, my issue came down to two things. I don't want to sound too critical, because truth be told, it's a long time ago, and I'm not sure I'm clear enough on the memory to be super detailed. But as I recall, one of the things that I felt frustrated about was, in general, responsiveness on some of the interactables. And so effectively, by virtue of the choices they made in regards to that, it felt clunkier than I felt it needed to feel. And that bothered me. And, this is the early days of those types of games, to be honest, but I just, understand that I'm now seeing what things are being done on the console side of the space, and it felt like something that felt this clunky didn't feel correct when compared with some of the things that you're seeing in that space. And it was only years later that I really understood sort of the difference of how games were built particularly between Japanese builds and Western builds. And I'll go into that revelation a little bit later, but that was something that I understood, but I didn't understand, right? I could feel it, but I couldn't describe it.
Gotcha.
Best way I could put it.
Gotcha.
And so yeah, to me, it just felt a little bit clunky and a little bit, and because of the fact that I agree with your assessment, I think it was sort of PC forward. It just ended up feeling less smooth as a way to play, and that kind of got a little bit in the way of the experience for me.
Totally understand it. Now, again, was your role primarily somebody else has already submitted a design concept and
yes.
you're just supervising the production, or were you involved with the design?
No. For at this point, that had become much more of a discrete circumstance, and so I was much more what today would be a pure producer. I didn't do any design work per se. I would give feedback and design feedback, but we would argue over it. But I was not the one saying, "Hey, this is what I want you to do with the design. Here is how I want this to work." Well, no, that's not true. I did some of that too, but I was not conceptualizing design elements. I was not saying, "Hey, here's a new puzzle I want you to implement." I was instead giving feedback on the puzzle already in place. I was an editor, not a writer, is the simplest way to put it.
Okay. So you end up leaving to take a position at Sega. Before we get to that, though, as you were mentioning the Japanese game design, are you doing a lot of console gaming on the side? What does your gaming look like at this point?
Oh yeah, I mean, look, I played Zelda to death like everybody else in the NES. I played Mario. I played the early console games on Nintendo. I saw the growth of that space, and it fascinated me. And so I was definitely passionate about the possibilities of games on these devices. They were different types of games by and large, right? It was a different game experience, but it was still compelling to me. And so, yeah, I was spending time on those. I would say I was still at that time primarily what I was playing was primarily the type of fare that SSI did. So I was still very much in the middle of playing those types and styles of game. And I was, still very much an avid tabletop gamer, right? And so when I made the move over to Sega, in my head was, I want to see if I can bring those sensibilities to this space. That was my aspirational goal, which we will discuss because eventually that's what led to me leaving Sega Technical Institute. But yeah, I was originally hired as, like I said, the lead American designer to join the company as it was being formed, and there were lead Japanese designers as well. And the idea was that we would collaborate to try and get the best of both, right? Some of the sensibilities of the West versus the sensibilities of Japan, and hopefully make something great out of it. And yeah, so that's what I was hired to do. Mark brought me over, and we formed a very small team. And out of the gate, I was asked to start ideating on products that could be done for the Sega console. And my natural proclivities were to try and push towards an RPG, which is what he said he wanted me to do. He hired me to build an RPG for Sega. And so I started doing that. I started working on designs for a game that ultimately, ironically, would have ended up looking a lot like the Shadowrun game that ended up happening on the Sega Genesis sometime later, but was not the game that I ended up working on. But I started working on those and working on a series of designs for them. We brought on a level designer artist to sort of work on the level art for it. But before too long, Sega Corporate sort of went, hey, that's all well and good, but Super Mario, we need something like that. And have you seen this new Nintendo? Right? So we were like, oh, okay. So fairly quickly, I was retasked and asked to lead the design efforts of a game that eventually became known as Kid Chameleon. It was originally entitled Kevin Kid. And so we started working on that. And the basically corporate's instructions to us were, it's got to have more levels than Mario. It's got to have more gameplay, more levels. And that's the target we want to go after. We want you to build a platformer to go directly after them. And we're like, okay. So I shifted gears and stopped doing what I was doing on the RPG side, and we started working on platformers. And definitely not my forte. And so, I would say that I ended up going back to my previous reference, I didn't end up as the main designer on the sort of the moment-to-moment mechanics. And truth be told, the people that Mark put on that were really better at that than I was. I ended up doing almost all the levels in the game. I was primarily the level designer. And for the game, I did write the primary design document for the game, and was, as the lead designer, I was doing most of the documentation as well as all the level design and so forth. Small team, worked on that for a while, and eventually, that ended up, like I said, becoming Kid Chameleon, which, Sega shipped and had some success with. It certainly didn't blow, Super Mario out of the water, but it did well. But I did end up, as that project came to a close, leaving STI to return back to SSI, because basically they reached out to me and said, hey, we really want you to come back, and we'd like you to run the QA department that you said you wanted to build. So would you please come back? And I had frustrations with the fact that I'd been hired to become an RPG designer, and I wasn't doing that. And so I chose to return. And so I left STI after a year and a half and went back to SSI.
Okay, I've got questions.
I'm sure you do.
I do have to go back, though, just one step to your first tenure at SSI. Were you involved at all in the NES and Genesis ports of SSI games? So we had Pool of Radiance, Heroes of the Lance. I think,
and the answer is no.
And a Dragon Strike game.
That happened happened after I left.
After you left.
That was in the window where I was at STI.
Gotcha. And you were also involved with the Book Rogers, at least the first Book Rogers game.
I actually was involved with both, but to differing degrees, right? I was sort of at the beginning of Buck Rogers 1, and then I came in after I returned to SSI, and I ended up having to take over for the producer on Buck Rogers 2 because that producer became very ill. And so that person had to step aside, and I was asked to take over and get Matrix Cubed out the door. But yes, I was involved in both of them.
Okay. But you didn't have any involvement, or was it understood from the beginning that Book Rogers was going to get ported to the Genesis?
It was not understood from the beginning at all. Not at all. Yeah, there's a whole lot of interesting story behind Buck Rogers. To put it, not to find a point on it, because those companies don't exist anymore. I don't feel like I'm letting too much out of the bag here, but SSI did not initially have great enthusiasm for the IP, and so it was made as a mandate. If you wish to retain the D&D license, you must do this. And they were like, okay, we'll do this then, because we would like to work on D&D games. And so I remember some early conversations with our representative from TSR. I won't put him in hot water by naming him, but our representative from TSR, who used to come out and we would have dialogues to talk about, well, the game and what we're doing and so forth. And I remember a conversation where I had with him where I was like, so I got to ask you, I mean, tell me a little bit about this. What's your feeling about, trying to apply this and do this? And what's your take? And he would simply smile at me and go, Buck is wonderful. Buck is good. And that is all he would say to any question I would ask. I was like, got it. All right. That understood. Message received. We'll just get back to work. So anyway, no, I had no idea it was going to end up on NES. Yeah,
well, it didn't end up on NES, but the first one,
or not NES,
to the Genesis.
Yeah, Genesis,
yeah.
Right? Yeah,
okay,
that's what I meant.
Okay.
Makes for an amusing anecdote, I know.
Well, Joel had a lot to say about that.
I would imagine he did. I haven't I haven't watched that one.
He was also not enthused.
None of us were. We were doing what we had to do.
Yeah. And I have to also just briefly ask, when you're working on these licensed products, you talked about, doing research for the historical strategy games. Was that also one of your tasks to do to read up on the rule sets and source books for the pen and paper games so that you could make sure that the products were following those guidelines, or was it more loosey-goosey?
No, it very much was part of the process. I mean, when you're dealing with a direct IP, it's very important. Now, that having been said, look, we were a bunch of nerds who were passionate about this stuff anyway, so there wasn't exactly a lot of, I need to go research D&D to see if I'm doing it right. It was like, yeah, we're doing this anyway. I mean, so that really wasn't a thing. People knew that stuff inside out, upside down, and backwards because we were passionate about it. And so, yeah, the answer is yes to your question. Yes, that was part of our responsibility, was to make sure that we were being authentic. But it really wasn't a problem.
Gotcha. Now, going back to the first project you were working on at Sega Technical Institute.
Yes.
And trust me, there's a reason I wanted to go back and talk about those console versions, because you said it was similar to the Shadowrun game that would later appear on the Genesis, another game that I played extensively.
I was a huge fan of that game.
Yeah, huge fan. I mean, it's a beautiful implementation of the setting.
It is.
So my question is, were you going to be making the game real time, or was it also going to have turn-based elements?
I definitely wanted turn-based elements because that's my roots, right? And that was the design that I was aiming towards, with basically a grid-based movement, space and so forth. And I'm pretty sure I don't have any of those early design docs anymore, but at one point I had all my old design docs for sort of the basic systems that I wanted to implement. But yeah, that was definitely it was intended to be a turn-based RPG on that platform, because at the end of the day, that was, like I said, my passion, my roots. I'm a tabletop RPG or a tabletop gamer. So I liked the idea of that. The inspirational games that I was looking at out there as far as RPGs is, later on you would see games like the Phantasy Star series and, so forth and so on, right? And those types of things were the direction I was trying to aim with this. I built several proposals based in different genres with different bents to try and, sort of get one to resonate with corporate, but alas and alack, they wanted a platformer. So the rest, as they say, is history. None of those ever saw the light of day. They never got even into medium development. They were all prototypey at best, and that was as far as they got.
Oh, too bad. And you said you were using different genres. Which genre would you have preferred to have used at that point? I would say that I would have leaned into either one of my science fiction genres or something vaguely cyberpunky, because I felt those genres were, at the time, very interesting, very compelling. There was a lot of good writing that was happening around them in that era. And so I thought it would have been something that could have resonated well with players. And so, yeah, that's where my main focuses were. One was in, sort of the sci-fi, straight sci-fi space genre, almost a little bit of a horror bent. And then the other was almost straight cyberpunk. Gotcha.
I had others, but those are the two that I was really, really pushing. But they didn't get anywhere. Like I said, we never got terribly far because the order came down relatively quickly.
Gotcha. So when you do start working on Kid Chameleon,
yeah,
what were there any big surprises that hit you where development for console games differed greatly from development for computer systems?
Well, yeah. I mean, obviously the interface is different, so you have to think about how you interact with the game in a completely different way. And I very much, had to sort of learn to adapt to that space, right? Because, I'm used to thinking in a very turn-based, control environment about, it's a thinking person's game. You're trying to think through what you're trying to achieve. Even in the D&D games, it's a tactical game, right?
Yeah.
And this was not. This was something completely different. And so, it was a complete paradigm shift for me. And that's probably why ultimately I ended up doing level design, because it was much easier for me to make that transition to being, able to be productive and helpful to what we were trying to achieve, because otherwise I was kind of operating outside of my comfort zone far enough that I was not as effective as I could have been or should have been as the lead on that project. So, Mark definitely took a very heavy hand in regards to shaping the combat side and the development side, character side, and rightfully so. Mark Cerny is a legitimate super genius. Yeah. Well, one of the things that I like to say about my experience working for Mark, probably the number one thing that I have to be very grateful to Mark for is that, as I mentioned previously, at that point in my career, it was very valuable to discover that I was in fact not the smartest guy in the room. And when you're in the room with Mark Cerny, you're not the smartest guy in the room. He is. He's probably the smartest human being I will ever actually have met in my lifetime. Understand you're talking about a guy who graduated with a degree from Berkeley at age 17. The same year, he also designed the hardware and software to Marble Madness. You may have heard of that game.
Yeah.
That was when he was 17. Right? Taught himself Japanese, moved to Japan. By the age of 24, he was a director in a Japanese company as a gaijin, which is impossible, and yet he was. So Mark is a remarkable, remarkable guy, and he taught me that I was not nearly as smart as I thought I was, which I needed to know at that point in my career, and it was a very formative data point for me to gain, which I am eternally grateful for.
Makes perfect sense. So you mentioned it that corporate wasn't interested. So you were hired to do an RPG, and now who was making that hiring decision at that point? Was that Roger Hector or was it somebody else? No,
Mark Cerny hired me.
Cerny.
I actually missed Roger. I worked for Roger, but not there.
Okay.
I actually exited right before Roger. Well, not right before, but before Roger took over at STI. He took over from Mark Cerny when Mark Cerny exited, and he stepped in and took over STI. But I left before Mark Cerny exited. I left right when Yuji Naka joined STI. And, you know, they imported Yuji Naka from Japan. He came in all rock star, and, you know, came in to sort of take over STI. And that was sort of like the time I'm like, you know what? This isn't really the thing for me anyway. SSI was really petitioning for me to come back. I'm going to go back to that place and you know, help them out.
So from what you're saying, during your time at STI, the idea of, you know, this hybrid studio that's supposed to find the best of both worlds and so forth wasn't really coming to fruition because you were still getting the commands of this is the type of product we need, which didn't really fit with this experimental idea.
Yeah, I actually think that's a very good way of putting it. I don't think STI was successful for its original charter. It was successful in that it made some interesting products, and it was great for some of the people that worked there in that it helped them sort of go on to be successful in their careers and grow as industry people. I learned a ton from the experience. Kid Chameleon was a great game. I'm proud of that game. I still get asked about it all the time. And so, you know, I think there was a lot of upside, but ultimately the charter that it was for was not successful, and I think that largely had to do with a little bit of lack of clarity on sort of how to achieve that goal. And it wasn't until many years later that I understood the fundamental differences between the approaches of Japanese game development and what I would generally clump together as Western game development. And it's an oversimplification, but the best description I ever got from it, and this was some years later when I was talking with a Japanese designer from Namco, and we mutually came to the realization of the idea of Japanese game development is very much inside out, right? What I mean by that is you fixate on a mechanic. Here, what's the core mechanic that you want this game to be about? And you grab that mechanic and you iterate on it until it's perfected. And then you wrap the rest of the game around it. Whereas Western game development tends to be very outside in. And this is an oversimplification, but there's some real truth to this. So you'll think about what's our high concept, what are we trying to achieve, what's our backstory, blah, 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 all this stuff. And then we're going to figure out how mechanics that will service that vision. And it's completely the opposite of where Japanese, it's like, yeah, you know, and that's why you get some really interesting story stuff sometimes on some of these Japanese games where they have an incredible, you know, gameplay mechanic, but they're like, yeah, whatever, slap some stuff on the outside, it's fine. Right? And I know it's an oversimplification, but I had no concept of this. And that was one of the things that was interesting is that the Japanese designers and myself, we would approach problems very, very differently. And we would look at the games in a very different way. I think the idea of STI had tremendous merit. They just didn't know how to really get that to happen. They just sort of threw us together and said, let's see what happens. we'll stir them together in a pot. And if there had been a little more intention and a little more organization about how to get the best out of those things, I think the idea had real merit.
And there was probably no better person than Mark Cerny at that time to even attempt that, because he had the experience on both sides.
100% agree.
Yeah.
100% agree. Yeah, Mark was the right choice for them to try this with. And like I said, ultimately the experiment, can be viewed as a only semi-successful experiment, or perhaps a semi-unsuccessful experiment, but good things came out of it. So certainly not a complete failure.
No, definitely. I mean, it was after your time, but Comic Zone is probably still my favorite Genesis game. So
there you go.
Yeah.
Yeah, SSI brought me back to take over the sort of burgeoning QA lab that they had built when I was away. So that's what I did. It was, at this point, the company has moved to Sunnyvale, is in a new building in this sort of technology park down in Sunnyvale. Had definitely a different feel from the old Rengstorff building, much higher capacity, number of people. And I actually had a full-time dedicated QA department of, a dozen plus people for the express purpose of testing all the various games that were now coming through, right? And obviously we're still doing our classic, strategy type games, but we're also doing a whole range of other things, right? Even some of the historical games were becoming a lot more sophisticated, and not just in complexity, but also different styles of games, like the Great Naval Battles game series or something like that. And then, of course, also the other experiments and branches where we were like, the Eye of the Beholder series or what have you, right? So it was a pretty different experience from the standpoint of now I'm responsible for ensuring that all of these games, which once again don't patch, are going out the door and going out the door clean, so that was my new role. I came on board during a period when the company had multiple internal projects going, Gold Box Games, also development of the new Dark Sun engine. It was an interesting and very, very hectic time. We had a lot of products going through the QA department, and I had to sort of teach people what the responsibilities of a QA department were, which was interesting because I was learning this on the job, right? I mean, this is a new thing. A significant dedicated QA department was something that I hadn't had before. It was, we had testers, but we didn't have this level of organization, and now I was being asked to sort of put that together. And so I was teaching them how to build test plans. I was, teaching them how to communicate bugs. Don't write up the bug that says the game crashes a lot, please. That doesn't help us. That sort of thing. And yeah, it was successful. We had a good group of people who were very passionate about what they did. The idea of people who viewed themselves as professional testers was something that was kind of new. I mean, there are people that worked for me in that department, and this is 1992, who to this day are still professional testers and very good at it.
Now, that definition that you talked about what it means to be a tester, because you mentioned games like Eye of the Beholder 2, the Dark Sun engine is coming along. Most people, when they're thinking testers, is there a fault in the game logic? Are there glitchy images here and there? But you're also coming into this era. The lead platform for Eye of the Beholder is the PC. You now have a billion different possible configurations. Is QA now also responsible for testing the games? Not only do they work internally, but do they work internally when run on different hardware?
100%. We had Honestly, this was one of the earliest, I would think, of that era of what now would be called a compatibility lab, right? And where we would literally take every piece of hardware we could find or think of that would perform a role, a sound card, a graphics card, what have you, and put them into these machines, and we would build discrete machines with specific setups to test various types. We would buy off-the-shelf machines, get a Radio Shack PC. We would get a Gateway PC. I'm trying to name ones that are dead because it's funny. But we would try to get these various models of machines that were pre-built, and then we would also do custom builds where we would mix and match hardware to try and maximize our chances of finding something really unique that would cause a problem for our consumers, because obviously our goal is to make happy customers. And one of the things that was really challenging for us was this was at an era where we didn't have as sophisticated hardware manufacturers as we have today. So, for example, this is an interesting bit. One of the brainchild ideas I had, I'm making fun of myself now, was at one point I'm like, okay, we'll do this, and then I want to, on a weekend, have everybody come in, and we're going to lay out all the hardware, and then we're going to rearrange it. We're going to try different combinations. So we'll take all the hardware out of machines, and then we'll say, okay, the sound card in that one now goes on that one, and blah 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 blah. Oh, it seemed like a good idea at the time.
Sorry, yeah, okay.
I mean,
I'll let you tell it.
No, it's fine. I mean, we understood drivers, so we knew how to install drivers. That wasn't going to be the problem. The problem was this was an era where no matter how much you protected yourself with static mats and handling everything correctly, hardware just didn't like that at all. And so I did that, and about 50% of our hardware just died. Like sound cards, everything. Like sound cards, graphics cards, motherboards, they were just like, nope, I don't like this configuration. I'm just going to die now. Sorry. But the idea was, sounds better in hindsight. The idea was that we would maximize the number of possible things that we would encounter so that we could hopefully ensure that consumers didn't face something that we hadn't tested against, and hopefully have a good play experience. That was the idea. So yeah, to your question, yeah, we spent a lot of time trying to work on PC basically options or PC deployments to try and mimic what a player may face. And yes, and it was a big part of what we would try to do.
In conjunction with that, I guess here's a chicken and the egg question. The minimum and recommended specs that would end up on a box of a PC game.
Yep.
Were those established before you guys got tested, or were those the result of the testing?
Great question. Early on, the latter. Later on, the former.
Okay.
Right? Early on, when we were beginning to do that, I would say that more often than not, we would just sort of see what it looked like and then go, hey, I don't think I would run this on anything less than that, right? Whereas later on, you would generally come in with a very specific idea of this is what I want for frame rate and this is what I want for, And so I think as it got more sophisticated, that became much more intentional. Now, at the time when we started, it was much more like, well, what does it look like? I think we can get away with this. Let's try it, and then we would put those specs on the box.
Gotcha. Was there any kind of market research being done about installed base or installed base amongst potential purchasers in order to determine what hardware specs you should be shooting for, or was any of that being done at the company or being purchased from outside?
Yeah, 100%. Less purchased outside, but yeah, I mean, that's the kind of stuff that we had a marketing department at that point. So we had people who would do that as part of their responsibility. Obviously, that would be in conjunction with Joel and Chuck and so forth. But yeah, that was something that they would think about a lot and give us feedback on as well. So yeah, it was done with some intentionality, but we were also expected to give them feedback on performance so that they could make an educated decision on what they wanted to put on the box.
Gotcha. Also around this time, SSI starts to import some European games, things like Surf City and so forth.
Flashback.
Flashback, exactly, yes.
The original Flashback, yes.
So what was the QA process like for these imported titles?
The same. I mean, we would basically treat them exactly the same way as an internal title. That just slowed the iteration speed. Right, so we would give a bunch of feedback, and then it would go into the ether, and then a build would appear, and then But other than that, it was really the same. I would be trying to organize a slate of titles and ensure that they were getting adequate coverage. The challenge was, of course, that it was spiky, and so I would try to I had a mixture of full timers and part timers, and I would try to spike, and same today with any QA department, I would try to spike our part-timers when we had an influx of games that needed to be tested. And then, we would taper back down to our core group when we had less. But ultimately, and that's part of the reason we had to have such a careful and professional, organized approach to it, because we were teaching people how to do this stuff. It's funny. I had a very good friend who used to make fun of me about, you just go to work and play games all day. And I'm like, yeah, dude, it's not like that at all. He's like, oh, yeah, sure. And so one time we were needing a bunch of part-timers. I'm like, hey, man, I'll get you a job. You can come down here and do this. Yeah, he lasted 3 months. And then he was like, oh, no, I'm out of here. Because it's hard. I mean, it's difficult work. I have tremendous respect for people who spend a career in QA. And it's actually that experience, because I built that QA department there and learned that craft early on in my career. It's actually been foundational through my career for me, in that I've always had very good relationships with QA departments, and it's something that I care very deeply about, because those are the people who are going to save my bacon. They're the ones who are going to, determine whether I'm able to release a clean game and be well received or not. So, and I know what that job is like. I know how hard that job is. And so I have always worked hard to cultivate a good relationship with QA, because it benefits the game. And like I said, I have a lot of respect for what they do.
Of course. I mean, as someone who's played plenty of games with bugs, yes, I do appreciate a good QA.
Well, you'd be surprised how many don't. And through the years, I've encountered plenty of organizations that treat QA as an afterthought. And I would make the argument that most mobile game companies, at least early on in the mobile space, didn't even think QA was a thing. Their idea of QA it's called the public. We just put it out there, and then they find stuff, and we're like, oh, we'll fix that. And so, professional QA is something that I feel strongly about and always have.
Now, you also mentioned the Dark Sun engine, which was being developed around the same time.
Yep.
And we've covered it on the show multiple times, talked to Joel Billings about it extensively, a very troubled development.
It was.
Yeah.
Well, so there's a simple thing about this. Building an engine is hard. And a significant number of companies have died on the rocks of building a game engine. And it's one of those things, you have a lofty aspiration of, we're going to build this engine, and it's going to be the thing that we can build all these games on forever and ever, and it will be fantastic. And that sounds good if you see it real fast. But in practice, not so much. Game engines are incredibly hard to build. They're incredibly hard to build when they're purpose-built for a specific game. When you're trying to build a game engine that will let you do multiple types of games, oh my God, that's just madness. There is a reason why Unreal is built to do their games, and then it's like, hey, if you want to use it, sure, you can use it too, but we built it for us. So anyway, yeah, I can imagine the things that Joel had to say about the DarkSide engine.
Oh yeah, no, yeah, it was a very entertaining conversation. Let's put it that way.
Yep.
Now, was the QA department at all involved with the development of, with the testing of the engine? Not the Dark Sun game itself, but were you guys already involved during the engine build process? Or were those two so interlinked that you were involved immediately?
I would love to tell you that we were smart enough to do it the right way and have us deeply involved from the beginning, but I would be lying. Nope, we were not that smart. So no, we did not do any of that. Later in life, I learned that, hey, embedding testers into the middle of engineering when you're doing things like this can actually have some real value. And engineering QA is a thing. Yeah, those were not a thing at that time. So we didn't do that at all, to our great regret.
Okay. I was about to say, I mean, it sounds like you guys would have been able to catch a lot of bugs and prevented some problems, but okay.
Yeah, that probably would have been true. Sure would have been smart. Alas, nope, we did not do that. And as such, yeah, I mean, there were a lot of things we did wrong with the Dark Sun engine. And so there was a lot of good lessons that we all took away from that experience. You know, I won't say, I mean, Joel, maybe he did. I have not watched your interview with Joel. I don't know if he feels that that was one of the catalysts that sort of, you know, put SSI into a spiral, but it certainly didn't help.
He sees that, but I think he gave a larger, in his opinion, it's, and I don't want to put words in his mouth, but it's more along the lines of the dependency on TSR and the personalities behind TSR and their proclivities.
Yes.
You mentioned Book Rogers.
Yes.
Did not help. I mean, the fact that the engine went out with Dark Sun, which was not the most popular game setting to begin with.
No. And that was a mandate, as I'm sure he told you. Right?
Exactly.
Yeah. No, let's be honest. You know, TSR killed SSI, but TSR also killed TSR. So, you know, it is an unfortunate reality that that creative companies driven by really amazing creative people very frequently then come into contact with not very creative people who like to count beans. And those people are very, very good at destroying companies built by creative people. And unfortunately, I have witnessed that firsthand far too many times in my career, as we will get to if we get that far. So,
if you give me the time, we will get that far.
Fair enough. Fair enough.
So yeah, so I have to ask then, from your internal, or I should go back first. You mentioned that when you came back to SSI, you were both managing the QA and you were also had a producer position.
Well, so initially, no, I was QA manager and that was it. But things evolved and I started being asked to do other things. Some of that was driven by me because I was, so one of the things that I can say I'm very proud of is that I got that QA department running kind of like a clock. And so it got to the point where I was like, I have bandwidth. I can do other stuff. If you would like me to, I can. And they were like, oh, well, you know, and so that was kind of where that came from. And I'm not trying to toot my own horn here. It's just that if you get a system in place and you have people who understand how to execute that system, it became something that didn't demand a tremendous amount of my day-to-day attention. And so I put bandwidth into helping with other games from a producer perspective. There are plenty of other producers in the building, so it was mostly me acting as a helper. But then I did get asked to take over, like I said, to sort of help get Buck 2 out the door because the producer became ill, and that they asked me to do that. I even also did design work. If you look, I show up on Secret of the Silver Blades as a designer because I did design on that game because they asked me to, and I'm like, sure. So I'm not sure I would say that my levels were great, but they were there. So
yeah.
They were hard, but I blame Dave Shelley for that. Anyway.
So what was the internal perspective on the status of TSR 92, 93 as the Dark Sun engine is being developed, as the Gold Box engine is getting a little bit long in the tooth, as the strategy games are, I'm guessing, not selling as well at, they're probably selling as well or better than they used to, but considering the ever increasing cost of producing them through artwork and so forth, probably not justifying themselves. Were these realities perceived inside the company, or yes, am I getting any of that wrong? Correct me if I'm
No. Yes and no. So I would say that the company, that some of the individuals within the company struggled with that transition and understanding how to grab a hold of the right angles, right? So I'll give you a couple of little tidbits of interesting information. One of the other things that I did in that era is I was asked to be the guy who reviewed games that came through the door as submissions.
Okay.
So I did so, and I would give commentary and a little write-up, and I would take it to Chuck Krogel, and I'd say, here's my opinion, and he would do with it what he would. That's because I was QA, and it was very easy to hand him to testers and get our feedback, right? So I got handed a little game that I went back to him, and I was like, dude, this is freaking amazing. You got to publish this game. And he's like, the graphics aren't all that good. Yeah. And so he passed on Master of Orion.
Oh, geez.
Yeah. So there were a couple of misses like that. I won't go into all the others, but we had a couple of opportunities that we didn't hit on. We did hit on one that I had a hand in, which is I was obsessed with a Sega Genesis game that I'm going to butcher the Japanese and say I think it was called Advanced Daisen Ryaku, which I think translates to Advanced Strategic Confrontation, but it was a Genesis war game. Super, super duper, well, I'll be blunt and say it was what eventually became Panzer General. I basically took it to Chuck and said, look at this. And he was like, oh, that's really interesting. We should see if we can, pursue something along that axis. And that's what led to becoming eventually Panzer General. And so that was what I would call not a miss, right? That was definitely a hit where they looked at it and went, yeah, this is compelling. We could do something with this, which they did. And they had great success with the Panzer General series. But there were also misses like the one I previously mentioned. There were others. I was responsible. Apologies. I was responsible for getting SSI in bed with FOSSA. I don't know if you've ever heard of the name. Oh, good.
Oh, right. Shadowrun, yeah.
Okay, well, duh. You're Shadowrun guy. You know who FOSSA is. So I got them hooked up with FOSSA, and we did not get access to their big licenses, but I was enamored of a particular board game that they made, one of Jordan Weissman's other designs, called Renegade Legion Interceptor. And I was the guy that pimped that hard and pitched that and got them to buy off on it. And so ultimately it led to a couple of games that SSI did with that license. And so one of them was a very straight adaptation of the paper board game, and the other one was more of a pseudo flight simulator thing. But they were not successful. So that was my contribution to the miss category. But, you know, by and large, you know, to answer your original question, I think it's safe to say that, you know, it was a time of evolution in the industry. There was a lot going on, a lot of change, a lot of growth. And yes, there was a lot of sort of attachment to roots and us trying to figure out what worked, all within the tapestry of trying to work with TSR and make that work. And it led to, you know, some good decisions, a lot of not great decisions. And ultimately that put the company in harm's way, and we know how it ended. So a long-winded way of answering your question in a circular way. Sorry about that.
No. It's there's nuance necessary for understanding that situation. Now, are you at SSI all the way to the bitter end?
No. I left SSI in 93, I think. It was after another year and a half of SSI. I got basically pitched by a little hardware company in Fremont, California that no longer exists. And there's a really entertaining story with this, called MediaVision. They did sound cards and branched into CD drives and other stuff. And they were basically positioning themselves as a multimedia company. And they pitched me on coming over and running their external development group and QA lab, working with some external partners, right? So my job would be to be an external producer working with external developers and also run a little QA lab. And I was like, okay. And so I went over there and went to work for them.
Just out of curiosity, which year is this?
I want to say this is 93, 94. I want to say 94, but hold on. Let me look up. Yeah, this is sad. I'm looking at my own LinkedIn history to see if it will remind me. I'm old, so bear with me.
It happens to me too, so don't worry about it.
So,
all good.
But I want to say this is probably 93, 94. And I can't even find my own profile now. There it is. Okay. So it should be listed there if I go all the way back to the dark ages. And yes, 93. Yeah, is late 92 and 93 is when I went over there as, quote, QA manager and producer. And okay. So go ahead. Sorry.
Well, I was going to ask because that would have put you right around the time when SSI does start to do a little bit more console work, and you had mentioned previously the launch of the Genesis version of Book Rogers happens on your second stay there.
No, it happened at the end of it happened after I left, but it was conceptualizing while I was there. I did not have a hand on the Genesis version. Okay.
Were you involved at all with Slayer, that 3DO game?
Nope.
Okay. It was just, and you probably also had no direct contact with the arcade game Tower of Doom, right?
I did not. No, you're correct.
Okay.
Wow, that's a memory. A name I hadn't heard in a long time. Yes, I know what you're talking about, and no, I did not.
Oh, okay. Well, I was just curious. I know that the SSI logo shows up on it. It's probably a 100% Capcom production at that point. But
I believe it was, but yeah, I couldn't tell you the details of that. I know people who can, but I am not one of them.
Okay. Well, I was just curious to see what experiences you may have had outside of the PC realm while you're there, just to get an idea of what you're taking with you to the next position.
Right.
But so And beyond pitching the idea for for the game mechanics that become Panzer General, were you involved at all with Panzer General?
Not in the least.
Not in the least. Okay.
Nope. That was a project that they started on in response to me sort of, prodding them, but I didn't have a hand in it whatsoever.
Okay.
Lovely game though. I love the original, the Japanese game, and I love that one as well.
Well, that's hey, sometimes it's just good to be a fan.
And I was, but yeah, I had no hand in it whatsoever.
Okay, cool. Sorry, I didn't want to interrupt you on that, but
no, that's fine.
Just thought I'd ask.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I that was after my time. I want to say that didn't come out until like 93, 94, right?
94.
There you go. Yeah, it was definitely after my time.
Okay.
So anyway, let's see. So I moved on to MediaVision, built a little QA department there. They were working on something that was really new, CD-ROM based titles. Understand, makes sense. They're selling CD-ROMs. That's kind of their thing. They're positioning themselves as a multimedia company before anybody knew what that was. And so we were working on games to be delivered on CD-ROMs that were kind of all over the map, but a couple of them were the first, or not the first, but early attempts at interactive film. So I worked on a couple of games called the Vortex, and Quantum Gate, and then the Vortex. And actually, the Vortex was after I left. Quantum Gate and Critical Path, which were basically live action film put into a choices type of thing where you could make a choice and it would branch the narrative, right?
Yeah.
Interesting stuff. My time there was very short, largely because not to find a point on it, the CEO of MediaVision turned out to be a criminal. And one day I went into work and the FBI showed up at the same time as the SEC showing up. And that was that. Our company went from, I think our stock went from like $64 to 1/8 in 24 hours. And they shut it all down. The CEO went to prison and we were all unemployed.
Now, I've got a couple of issues with MediaVision because MediaVision I've started to deep dive on them in the build up to what you're talking about for my other episodes.
Okay.
And so MediaVision, you said you were there to do interactive movies, FMV based titles.
Yep.
Now, what was, or I should ask here, when you got there, what was the level of technology already developed, tools-wise, for that kind of production?
Well, these were external developments. So the tools were done by the companies that we were working for. We were purely a publisher. So
okay.
This was my first, actually my very first foray into being a publishing producer, which is to say that there was an external developer and I had minimal involvement in the development of the product, other than just, ensuring that it met standards and then getting it tested and blah, 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 and then getting it published. And so Hyperbole Studios was the one doing the Quantum Gate product. And I cannot remember the name of the company that did Critical Path, but yeah, they were external companies that did the work, right? They would actually build the engine, get the technology, hire the actors and actresses, and make the game. And then, so that was a bit of a new experience for me. But yeah, my role was entirely coordination and production from a publishing perspective.
Okay. And Hyperbole was completely independent of MediaVision?
100%.
Interesting.
Yeah, they were a little developer up in Seattle, led by a guy by the name of Greg Roach, who we'll talk about him again in a minute, because he actually got one of the more interesting panels at Computer Game Developers Conference in, I want to say, '93, where it was him. Chris Crawford was the organizer of it. And it was him and Chris Crawford and Sid Meier all talking about the future of games in a panel. And I'm like, that was interesting stuff. Actually, I think that might have been '94. But anyway, yes, it was. It was down in LA at GDC down there, and it was trippy stuff. It was good stuff.
Oh, that panel alone, yeah. I mean, that's
yeah. Well, it was a very interesting memory, a vivid memory of that panel, and like at one point being asked the question of those people of, if you're going to be stuck on a desert island, who do you want to be stuck with? And Sid Meier going, just my development kit. That's it. Just give me my development suite, and on a desert island, I'm fine. And Greg Roach is like Marilyn Monroe, and it was just funny. So good stuff. But I apologize. I'm off track now.
No, not at all. Not at all. That's brilliant. So you're talking to these guys. I'm guessing they're sending you builds of the game.
Correct. Yeah, and they're sending us builds of the game. We're testing them. We're giving them feedback. That's sort of normal publishing iteration process. We didn't have a hand in the actual filming, for example, other than coordination, right? So we would actually be on site for the filming to be able to, as a publisher representative, and but in general, it was fairly hands-off. It was fairly arm's distance. They were doing most of the development, which is not atypical for publishing productions.
Gotcha.
And there were other games too beyond full motion video games. There was like My Favorite Garden or My Secret Garden or something like that, where it was like a little gardening game. There were a couple of these. They're all CD-ROM based games though.
Gotcha. Now, MediaVision at this point, like you said, is also a hardware manufacturer. Were you involved, or did you have any contact with the hardware side of things as this?
No. And probably just as well, given how things turned out. But no, we did not. The only contact we really had was I knew an engineer there who worked on the hardware side. He was one of the people that recruited me over because he had worked at SSI and had moved there as an engineer. And he was the one that connected the dots for me to that place. And other than that, it was just through my boss, who has gone on to a great and successful career as a CEO, but was basically my director at the time, or a VP of our division.
Gotcha. Because I was going to ask whether or not the hardware that they were developing was being considered as supporting hardware for the games that were being developed, because I do believe MediaVision had at least announced an add-on card for full motion video.
They had a
card, and they also had taken over the 3D accelerator hardware that had originally been developed by Silicon Graphics, and that
Correct.
Team would later on start 3DFX. So I wasn't sure if the game development side was somehow had a mandate to make sure that the software being produced would support the hardware that was being manufactured.
So yes, and we did interact with the hardware groups for that purpose, but it was fairly lightweight at that point. I would say that it was an aspirational goal, but at this point it was still sort of a lightweight impact. I think had MediaVision not imploded, it would have become a focus. The synergy would have become a bigger focus than it was at that time. I think they were just trying to get the groups started.
Gotcha. Okay. Good. So you show up at the same time as the feds, and
It was an interesting day.
and you decide then that you should I'm guessing that you decide that you probably need to look for gainful employment elsewhere.
Well, there wasn't much deciding. The company kind of went away. So yes, I looked for gainful employment elsewhere. I basically, I did the classic thing of reaching out to our external developers and saying, well, I got some bad news. And Hyperbole actually said, hey, well, you could come up here and work with us. We like working with you. And so that actually is what happened. I ended up joining Hyperbole and moving up to Seattle to basically do the same job, except now locally in the building, right? So I was now because they didn't really have a producer. So I was asked to come in and become the producer on the Vortex, which was their sequel to Quantum Gate. And so I did.
And now, Hyperbole Studios, at least their website is still active.
I find that very interesting.
Yes. I think the last game that they have, they've got a big gap, but the last game they have listed as a new title wasn't actually that many years ago. So, although the website looks like it was designed in 1997 and hasn't been updated since.
I think that's probably about accurate.
Okay.
Yeah. So,
so what is the environment there like when you actually get there? I guess now we're going back to the tools question and so forth, because this is early days for FMV and multimedia still.
Well, there's some stories in there. All right. Let me approach this a couple ways. First of all, they had some very good technologists who understood software engineering and were very good at software engineering. They did bring over technologists from the full motion video space who had experience working with codecs and the like. I won't tell you what industry they came from, but you can probably make a good guess. We'll just leave it at that, shall we? But they were very good. And so they actually had a really strong technology team. On the creative side, Greg was sort of the CCO as well as the CEO. He was the creative visionary. He had the ideas, but he did have designers who, would be tasked with sort of the elements of the design scenarios. And then my job was wrangling, which was an interesting job. I'll simply say that it was a small studio that hadn't really been run as a professional business, so all that much. It was more like a gaggle of people who worked together on stuff. And so it was a little disorganized. I ended up in a very weird position. I reported to the VP, Hallie Evelyn, and her ex-husband reported to me, who is the CTO. It was an interesting relationship. I won't go into a lot of that because not suitable, but it did make for an interesting, challenging environment. There was plenty of talent in the building. I did have the honor of hiring some people into the industry to come join that company who have gone on to excellent careers in the business. But it was it was definitely a little bit of a, figuring it out as we went along type of experience. And it had the additional challenges of they weren't entirely sure sort of what their vision path was. They were kind of trying to figure it out as they went along. And so ultimately, they were on a trajectory that was not great. And it was pretty easy to see that pretty early, right? The sales of those full motion titles was not great. And they were already getting surpassed by more sophisticated titles. And so their future trajectory wasn't bright. And so, to cut right to it, I actually was asked to sit in on a number of their business meetings where they were trying to figure out the path of the business and how do we make this all work. And ultimately I said, well, here's what I would recommend you do in order to make this business viable. And it involved a lot of, you need to get back to the basics. You need to scale down to the specific core of what you need to be able to execute against this vision. So here are the people that I would keep, and I would lay everybody else off. And I was on the layoff list. So effectively, I laid myself off because they looked at the proposal and said, well, that seems to make sense. So they did that, and I left. So I was only there literally like a year.
Gotcha.
And then, I laid myself off, which is an amazing story. It's fun to be able to say that. Not a lot of people can.
Now, was this an honest, just you trying to be perfectly honest with what was best for the company, or was it?
It was 100%
attempt to get out.
No. It was 100% that. One of the aspects of me, and we haven't really gone into this much, and I'm not even sure you necessarily want to, but one of the aspects of me is that I'm really pretty much a straight shooter. I commit to a company. When I join a company, I'm all in. And that is just the way I am. That's the way I'm wired. So if I'm here, I'm here. And I'm going to do whatever I can to help you succeed. And if I think you're in trouble, I'm going to tell you. And if I think the right thing to do is a thing, I'm going to say it, even if that thing isn't necessarily great for me, right? So no, it was just me being honest and saying, I'll be honest with you, I think the only way you survive is this. And ultimately, they did survive. They went on to make the X-Files game, and right, that was without me. And it was the right call to do what they did. They paired back to that core group, and they had a little bit more life in them and did some stuff. So no, it was entirely from that perspective. I'm not shy about bailing out, as you will learn as we continue. I'm not shy about bailing out if I'm like, oh, this is not right. And so I will. This was not that. This was me genuinely trying to help them because they asked me to.
Gotcha.
I was trying to do my job.
And that meant getting rid of your job.
Which meant get rid of my job, because ultimately I was superfluous to the basic core of what they're trying to accomplish, as were a number of other people. And so there you go.
I hope you've enjoyed the first part of our interview with Graeme Bayless. We will be picking up right here in part 2. I look forward to that, as you should as well. We'll be going into his career at Dynamix and so many more companies. It gets entertaining. There's a lot of hours left. So until next time, have fun. I hope you've enjoyed another Video Game Newsroom Time Machine interview. You can leave us comments on Twitter, Instagram, and if you like what we're doing here, drop us a couple of bucks on Patreon. All the links are in the description below.